Imagine a quiet evening in a wealthy neighborhood. Street lamps illuminate perfectly paved roads, expensive cars and manicured lawns. At first glance, it's a picture of a quiet life, but something changes in the air. A white police officer slowly drives up to an expensive car where a black man dressed in an expensive suit is about to get out. Officer Davis feels suspicious. He already has a picture in his head. Who is this man? How did he get here? This preconceived notion causes him to make a fatal mistake. Stop! Put your hands on the hood. The officer's voice is rough. His movements are abrupt. The man, remaining calm, tries to explain that he is the owner of this car, that this is his house at the end of the street. But Davis is not listening. He is sure there is a criminal in front of him. Friends, what would you do in his place? Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. Your opinions are very important to us. You are part of our history, and each of your comments helps us develop and promote our channel. We value each of you, and your participation makes our community stronger. Every word, every support is important to us. You help us tell these stories, raising important issues that cannot be ignored. Please share your opinion, because you really matter to us. Enjoy watching. The night was quiet, save for the rustling wind and the occasional car on the deserted streets of the affluent neighborhood. Officer Davis was patrolling a familiar area. Everything seemed normal until he noticed a shiny black car parked at the curb. A dark-skinned man in an expensive suit was slowly getting out of the car, as if enjoying the quiet of the night. Something in the officer's chest skipped a beat. What's he doing here? Flashed through his mind. Davis didn't need to check the car's license plate or papers. He had already decided that this was not the owner of this luxury car, but a criminal. Without hesitation, he drove the car to the curb, got out, and called out to the stranger sharply, "Hey, get your hands on the car." The man froze, surprise flashing across his face. He was calm, as if he was unaware that he was being looked at with suspicious eyes. "Have I done something wrong?" His voice was low and even, but there was a confidence in it that only angered Davis. He was not used to that tone. "Put your hands on the hood." The officer's rudeness grew, and the tension in the air became thick as smoke. The man, trying to remain calm, slowly raised his hands, pressing them to the cold metal of the car, but his eyes never left the officer. There was no fear in them, and this angered Davis even more. "What? You think you can just drive around in cars like that?" Davis hissed with hatred, already reaching for the handcuffs. In his head, it was all clear. A black man in an expensive neighborhood with a car like that? He was a car thief. It didn't matter that he was dressed like a businessman, not a criminal. It didn't matter that his hands weren't shaking. Deep down, Davis knew no. He was sure that he was doing the right thing. As the cold handcuffs snapped onto the man's wrists, he said quietly, "You didn't even ask who I was. You know, this would be a big scandal." His voice was still level, and it sent a chill down the officer's spine. Fear stirred deep inside, but pride would not allow him to admit his mistake. Davis could already feel something more dangerous than a misunderstanding brewing beneath his skin, something that could ruin his life if the truth came out. But the officer could no longer stop. Officer Davis tightened his grip on the cuffs more than necessary, as if the gesture would make him feel in control again. But the man's words echoed in his head. Scandal? What could he mean? And why did that calm, almost indifferent tone keep popping into his head? Davis took a step back, assessing the man, but not with the same careless arrogance he had moments ago. A low rumble of fear was building in his soul, one that had nothing to do with the threat of physical danger, but with the knowledge of his own mistake. "Shut up," he snapped, trying to suppress the anxiety that was surging through him. He tried to justify his actions to himself. Hadn't he followed the rules? Hadn't a suspicious black man in a neighborhood full of whites meant taking a risk? He was sure he had made the right choice when he approached the car. That certainty, rooted in prejudice, had fueled his actions from the start. But now that he had the man in handcuffs, doubts were beginning to erode that certainty from within. The man stood still, not struggling, not shouting, not even arguing, and this irritated Davis even more. "I'm not a criminal," the man finally said, looking the officer straight in the eye. His voice was as hard as steel, and there was an impeccable confidence in his own rightness. "My name is Jamal Brown. This is my car. I just got back from a business meeting. I live in this neighborhood." His tone contained no fear or aggression, just facts, as if he had nothing to prove. but Davis wouldn't listen. Another picture had already unfolded in his mind, a black man, aspiring to wealth and success in a world that Davis believed was not made for people like him. Why the hell would a black man own a car like that? The thoughts swirled around in his head, fueling his inner rage. "Shut up," Davis said again, anger welling up inside him, but his own words suddenly seemed hollow. He saw how Jamal's face remained calm, as if this whole scene was painfully familiar, as if people like Davis had been trying to oppress people like him his entire life. "You're arresting me for being a black man in a fancy car, right?" Jamal said it calmly, but each word hit Davis like a fist. The cop felt his heart speed up. These words were dangerous. If he made a mistake, if this situation backfired, it could ruin his career. "You think I have no rights?" Jamal continued, now with icy calm. "You think you can handcuff anyone who doesn't fit your idea of what a rich person should look like?" Davis froze. He suddenly found it hard to breathe. He knew the situation was spinning out of control, but instead of admitting his mistake, his pride wouldn't let him stop, because if he admitted his mistake now, he'd be admitting that his bias had been driving him all along, and that was the scariest part. "This is all your fault," Davis said through gritted teeth, trying to convince himself, but the words were no longer convincing. His hands were shaking as he tried to lead Jamal to the car. But before they reached the car, a white man ran out of a nearby house, clearly distressed. "What are you doing?" "That's Mr. Brown. Are you arresting him?" The man stopped in amazement, looking at the handcuffs on Jamal's hands. Davis felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "Mr. Brown?" This man was known in the area, respected, and this was not just a mistake. It was a disaster. Davis's mouth went dry. He had been sure he could explain his actions, after all. Wasn't he trying to protect order? But now it was all coming apart before his eyes. Jamal turned his head and looked straight at him, and there was no fear or anger in his gaze, only a cold confidence that justice would be done. Davis stood paralyzed, his mind racing between fear and rage. The white man, Jamal's neighbor, kept talking, but Davis barely heard him. His ears were ringing. Pride was like a steel trap, holding him back. Admit his mistake? Back down? No, he couldn't afford that. Mr. Brown, respectable man, it all sounded like a mockery. How could this black man be respectable? Davis had a hard time accepting a reality that was shattering his worldview. He decided he would not give in. The more the threat of exposure grew, the more he wanted to make Jamal feel humiliated. "Step back," he barked at his neighbor, clutching the radio on his shoulder like a lifeline. This was his chance to regain control. "This is a police matter. If you don't know anything, don't interfere." His voice was rough, almost aggressive, but inside, Davis was already starting to panic. He needed more time to think, to figure out how to get out of this situation. Jamal was silent, but his silence was heavier than any words. Davis could feel his eyes on him, cold, indifferent, robbing him of all respect. It infuriated him. How could this man stand so still while he was handcuffed? How could he look at him so coldly, as if Davis were worthless? "You think you can get out of this easy?" Davis finally blurted out, turning to Jamal and pushing him toward the car. Jamal staggered, but said nothing, just looked at him as if he had predicted the very fact that he had been pushed. There was no fear in that look, and that scared Davis even more. "You think because you're rich you can do anything?" Davis continued, his voice rising to a scream. The words rushed forward, as if he could no longer control them. "That you can be here, driving cars like this, living in houses like this? This isn't for people like you." He felt his own words sharpening, as if the wounds he was inflicting were meant to hurt Jamal, to make him feel worthless. But Jamal wouldn't give in. "No fear, no excuses. You really don't know what you're doing," Jamal finally said quietly. His voice was quiet, calm, but that only made it seem more threatening to Davis. He knew Jamal was no longer just a rich man. This man was far more dangerous than any criminal he had ever encountered. He could destroy his life with one word, one complaint. "I understand enough," Davis managed, feeling the cold sweat creeping down his back. He pushed Jamal again, trying to make him lose his damn calm, even for a second, but Jamal only swayed slightly and straightened up again. His face remained still, his eyes cold. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into," Jamal said calmly, looking Davis straight in the eye. At that moment, the officer became truly afraid. No amount of screaming, no amount of handcuffs could change the situation. could make this nightmare go away. Davis suddenly felt as if the whole world had shrunk to this moment, to these seconds when he stood before a man who could no longer be intimidated, who could no longer be humiliated. And the worst part was that Davis himself, for all his form and strength and power, looked weak. Davis gritted his teeth, feeling the tension inside him reach its breaking point. He couldn't afford to look weak. And yet, Jamal's cold gaze made him doubt his own strength. "You don't know who you're dealing with," the officer thought. He decided that his only defense was a show of authority. "You're just one of those guys who thinks they can buy everything with their skin and money," he blurted, his voice furious. He saw the words hit Jamal hard. The man's head tilted slightly, and something like annoyance flickered in his eyes. But Davis didn't notice. He kept talking, as if his words held the key to the power he so desperately sought. "Nobody wants your kind here. You're just another con man trying to get into a world that doesn't belong to him." His words echoed through the night like ominous thunder. He felt his anger welling up inside him. It didn't take long for Davis to turn to insults. In his mind, Jamal was no longer just a target for arrest, but a target for everything he knew about racial prejudice. Jamal smiled tightly, and it was a chilling smile. "So you really think I'm here by accident?" he said, his voice cold and calculating. "You accuse me of something I didn't do just because of the color of my skin. All you see is prejudice and fear. You can't accept that I can be successful in this society, just like you." The word shot through Davis like an arrow, and the thought flashed through his mind. How dare he talk to me like that? Every moment spent in this confrontation was like a spring, ready to snap at any moment. Davis felt the air heating up, but instead of retreating, he pushed his rage out even harder. "You don't know who you're talking to," he growled, furious and mad with fear and rage at the same time. His eyes gleamed menacingly. He stepped closer to Jamal, trying to break his spirit. "I can make it so you never leave here, and no one will even notice you're missing. You're just another criminal in my book." Jamal didn't flinch. His confidence only grew. "That's why your actions are unacceptable," he said, not looking away. "Your words are an expression of fear and prejudice. You can't accept that I'm successful, and that only fuels your hatred." As if in response to these words, the air around them began to boil. Davis, unable to contain his rage, grabbed Jamal by the sleeve and pushed him sharply toward the car. At this point, Jamal remained motionless, but his gaze became even more piercing, as if he could see into Davis's very soul. "You're the one who makes people afraid. You're the one who trains them to believe that I'm a threat. But you can't break me," Jamal said, his voice sharp and commanding, a confidence in his words that was completely unsettling to Davis. "Shut up. You have nothing but the color of your skin," Davis shouted, unable to bear the tension. He knew he was on the edge. This conversation could end in disaster for both Jamal and him. Jamal, for his part, just chuckled. "You can call me whatever you want, but I don't expect respect from you. I'm here to show that racism is not something that should have power over us. I will not let you humiliate me." Those words were the last straw for Davis. He felt his own hatred welling up inside him like a river about to burst. He leaned closer to Jamal, ready to say something terrible, but suddenly there was the sound of sirens. The patrol cars, called in by neighbors, joined forces to see what was happening. Davis, panicked, realized that his chances of success were rapidly disappearing. Confusion, rage, and fear were mounting, and he no longer knew how to get out of this situation. "You can't get away with this," Jamal said with confidence, as if he sensed that this night would change everything. The sirens grew louder, and Davis felt panic coursing through his body. His vision began to blur, but the anger only grew inside him. He looked at Jamal and felt everything he knew about the world begin to crumble. The officer couldn't afford to be at a disadvantage. If the neighbors saw he was wrong, it could be the end of his career. "You think you can just walk away from all this?" Davis screamed, trying to salvage what self-respect he had left. "You're nothing more than another criminal who thinks he has rights because he has money." He felt his words spiraling out of control, but he couldn't stop. It was the only thing that made him feel strong. Jamal looked at him, and his eyes reflected not only confidence but also deep regret. "You are so wrapped up in your own preconceived notions that you do not even notice how you are humiliating yourself," he said with cold calm. "Your fears and hatred of people who are different from you make you pathetic. You are defending your illusions, not the order." "Pathetic?" Davis snapped, his pride burning. He stepped closer to Jamal, ready to meet the challenge. You're the one who's pathetic, standing here in that expensive suit, in that car, trying to look better than you are. You don't belong here." His every breath was becoming more strained, his inner conflict more wrenching. Jamal didn't flinch. His confidence in his words only grew. "You know what's funny? You put on a uniform to protect the order, but in reality, you're just a tool of a system that oppresses people like me, and you can't change that, no matter how hard you try." As they stood face to face, the sirens grew closer. Davis knew he had no time left. This was his last chance. "Don't laugh at me," he screamed, leaning toward Jamal. "You think your successful career and wealth will protect you from the consequences? You're just another black man trying to prove his worth." The words echoed through the streets, spoken with hatred. Jamal looked at Davis with bitterness. "You don't understand that it is your hatred and prejudice that is causing this conflict. You think I don't deserve respect because I am black, and that makes you weak. You are nothing but a tool of racism that is tearing this community apart." The situation was escalating, and Davis knew he was losing control. He was torn apart by an internal conflict. He was a police officer, supposed to protect the peace, but his actions were turning him into a caricature of a protector. Anger and fear were boiling in his mind. "I will not let you get away with it," he screamed, no longer knowing how much force to use. Davis grabbed Jamal's arm, but Jamal pulled away instantly. "This is why we are here in this moment," Jamal said, his voice loud and clear, as if he knew every word mattered. "I will not take this humiliation, and I will not remain silent. I am here to show that racism will not go unnoticed. You want to silence me, but I am not one to give in." At that moment, the sounds of approaching cars finally ratcheted up the tension. Davis, consumed by hatred, suddenly felt like a trapped shadow. He knew his time was running out, but he was not going to give in. He challenged, "Let them come. I'll tell them you're a criminal, and they'll back me up." But this time, instead of fear, Davis saw a steely determination in Jamal's eyes. "I will fight for my name and my honor," Jamal said. It sounded like an oath, a promise he would keep. "You're just going to look stupid when this is all over, officer," Jamal continued. "I'm not just a black millionaire. I'm a man, and you can never bring me down. Your hatred only strengthens my resolve." In that moment, as the car headlights illuminated them, Davis felt his entire world crumble. He stood alone, surrounded by prejudice, fear, and hatred, and this man in front of him, who he thought should be afraid, was looking at him with a surprising intensity. There was no fear in Jamal's eyes, only a certainty that the truth would come out and he would be proven right. Davis felt his anger turn to rage, and not knowing how to deal with it, he took another step toward Jamal, his eyes blazing with madness. The situation was getting tense, and he knew he had to act to maintain his power, to avoid looking helpless in front of this criminal. "Look at you," he shouted, pointing at Jamal's expensive suit. "You think your money is going to make you more than just some black guy on the street? Your attempts to look important only highlight how out of place you are here." Davis couldn't stop. Every word he spoke was laced with hatred, and he felt that hatred giving him strength. "Do you think you can scare me with your status? Or think you'll be respected because you managed to get rich? You're nothing, just another black guy trying to pretend he can belong in this world." He leaned closer to Jamal, his breathing heavy with rage and superiority. Jamal, who stood motionless, only smirked in response, but Davis saw the glint in his eyes. "You don't know who I am," he said calmly, but there was a threat in his voice. This made Davis even more angry. It was supposed to break his confidence, make him feel humiliated. "Who are you, other than just a rich black man?" Davis yelled, grabbing Jamal by the sleeve and pulling him closer. "You think your money can buy respect? You're just another naive idiot who thinks he can change the way things are. But out here in this world, you just don't matter." Jamal tried to pull away, but Davis only tightened his grip, enjoying his power. "You're worthless without your money, and now that you're standing here, what do you really look like? Just a rich man's plaything with no honor or dignity," he shouted, making Jamal feel all the humiliation that only increased his own power. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Jamal said, bitterness creeping into his voice. He knew he couldn't give in to this pressure. "You're degrading yourself, and your words only prove that you're no better than those you've accused." But Davis just chuckled. "Oh, I'm better than you'll ever know," he said with a venomous grin. "I'm in uniform, and I'm the law. You're just a useless black man who thinks he can challenge authority. You're here to learn to respect your white brothers." Davis's words pierced the air like bullets. He was in his element, and he loved it. For a moment, he even felt his own fear weighing on him, gaining control of the situation. You're just another victim of your own racial bias. I'm here to show you that your wealth and your connections mean nothing when you're faced with real power. Jamal gritted his teeth and fought the urge to back down. He knew Davis was trying to break him, but at this point he felt he needed to show strength. You can't break me even if you try to humiliate me, he said with a confidence Davis lacked. But Davis, realizing he couldn't let Jamal look strong, stepped closer. You'll never be on my level. All that money and influence won't make you a man. You're just a worthless criminal who got lucky, he said, his voice laced with mockery. The sirens behind them grew louder, but at this point neither of them could tear themselves away from the other. Davis felt the tension tearing through him. He couldn't let this man win. The fight wasn't just an argument anymore. It was more than that. It was a clash of identities, a clash of races, a clash that would change the world come morning. Davis knew he had to finish Jamal off. He had to show everyone around him that he was the one in control. His pride wouldn't let him back down, and his hatred only fueled the fire inside him. He stepped closer to Jamal, his face twisted in anger. "Look at you," Davis cried, unable to contain his emotions. "You're nothing but a template for all the blacks who think they can measure up to the whites. You're nothing more than a fake dressed in expensive fabrics, and no one will take you seriously. Even if you bought that car and that suit, you'll never be able to hide who you really are." Every word he said was laced with hatred, and he could feel the prejudice brewing in his voice. There was no room for doubt in his mind. He was right, and Jamal was wrong. In his eyes, Jamal was not just a man, but a symbol of everything he didn't like about the world. Jamal, for his part, wasn't about to let Davis get the better of him. He knew this wasn't just a skirmish, but a reflection of deeper prejudices. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, his voice thick with bitterness. "You're letting your fears and hatred define how you see me. I shouldn't have to justify myself to you just because you can't handle your own demons." These words only increased Davis's anger. "Demons? You are a demon trying to pretend to be human," he barked, and Jamal felt his words pierce his very soul. In that moment, he realized that not only his freedom was at stake, but also his dignity as a human being. "You can't make me feel less than I am," he said, his voice growing more confident. "Your hatred only strengthens my resolve. I won't let you throw me down." But Davis only laughed. "You think you can stand before me with such impudence? You don't understand that all this talk will lead to nothing. I am the law, and you are a criminal, and even if you have wealth, you will still remain in your place," he shouted, feeling his own insecurity retreat under the onslaught of rage. The sirens finally blared, and the patrol cars began to pull up, filling the area with their lights and noise. Davis knew there was backup on the horizon, and that gave him confidence. "When my colleagues show up, they're going to see you for who you really are," he said with a wry smile. "You have no idea how quickly your life could change if I told you you were a criminal." Jamal looked at the approaching vehicles and felt his heart beat faster. He knew this was a crucial moment. He couldn't let Davis destroy him. "You think you can take the upper hand with your uniform and weapons, but that just shows how weak you are," he said, trying to remain calm. "Weak?" Davis shouted, hatred lacing his voice. "You're weak because you depend on pity instead of respect. You're not a man, just a stereotype I must eliminate to restore order." He shoved Jamal hard, his hands tightening around the handle of the cuffs. Jamal didn't flinch. "You can't break me. I will fight for my freedom and dignity, and no form will make you stronger." He began to rise, feeling anger and passion fill him. At that moment, officers stepped out of the patrol car. Davis quickly turned to them, as if to save himself. "Hey, there's this black criminal here, and I'm arresting him," he shouted, pointing at Jamal, his voice thick with anger. The officers, listening to his words, looked at Jamal with disbelief. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, his gaze wavering between Davis and Jamal. "He's here illegally, and I'm arresting him for attempting to commit a felony," Davis barked, his anger filling the air. "That's not true," Jamal shouted, his voice louder than ever. "I'm not a criminal, and I'm not going to let this officer humiliate me because of the color of my skin." His words were a challenge to the silence. The officers exchanged glances, and one of them stepped closer. "Davis, can you explain the situation?" he asked, a note of doubt in his voice. Davis felt his confidence begin to crack. He knew his words could be questioned, and his own actions could have consequences. He's just trying to take advantage of his race, he said dismissively, but his voice was no longer as confident. Racism will not go away, Jamal said, confidently looking into the eyes of the approaching officers. In that moment, he knew that his fight was not just for himself, but for everyone who suffered from bias. I will not give in, and I will not let this prejudice break me. The conflict had reached its climax. Every word, every movement was escalating the situation. There was tension in the air that would not be relieved until the truth was acknowledged, and each of them knew that this confrontation was only the beginning of something much greater. The situation was escalating with each passing second. Davis, feeling his power slipping away, grabbed Jamal by the shoulder and shoved him violently toward the patrol car. You think you can just stand there and challenge me? You're a black millionaire who doesn't deserve respect, he screamed, his voice shaking with hatred. Jamal, despite the rage he felt inside, tried to maintain his composure. He knew that every reaction he took could lead to more violence. You have no right to treat me like this, he replied, but the words had barely left his lips when Davis grabbed his sleeve again. What? Can't you just get over it? Davis growled, ignoring Jamal's calm. He could feel his own desperation turning against him, and it only added fuel to the fire. You're just another black man who thinks money can protect him from reality. No amount of money can save you from the law, and you know it. Jamal looked at Davis, gritting his teeth. He knew his words weren't just directed at him, but at everyone who was under the pressure of racial bias. I'm not a criminal, and I won't let you humiliate me based on the color of my skin, he said with determination, despite the fear that was gripping him. Oh, so you've decided to fight? Davis sneered, leaning in so close that Jamal could smell his sweat and hatred. Do you really think your black skin and expensive suit make you my equal? You're just playing a role, and I'm going to show you how quickly you'll lose your privilege. At that moment, other officers began to approach, and Jamal felt his heart beat faster. Please tell me what's going on, one of the new officers said, his voice full of confusion. He's a black man who has no right to be here. He's trying to frame us so he can get away with it, Davis screamed, his voice growing even more hysterical. He was afraid he was going to lose control of the situation. Jamal looked at the other officers, his eyes searching for support. That's not true. I was just in my car, minding my own business. He illegally detained me, he said, but the confidence in his voice was waning as he noticed the officers looking at him with disbelief. Davis felt his confidence grow with every word. He wasn't going to back down. Look at him. He's not just a black man. He's a black millionaire who thinks he can get away with it. He actually thinks he's on the same level as us. There was a fury in his voice that resonated in the air. The other officers exchanged glances, and Jamal felt the pressure mounting. He knew every second counted. I'm not a criminal. I won't let you do to me what you do to other black men. It's not right. His voice was loud, but it didn't have the same force it once had. Davis stepped closer and, turning to the new officers, said, Look at him fighting. That's proof. He really should be arrested. His face was twisted with hatred, and he felt he could win. Don't let him get away. We all know how they can game the system, Davis added, confidence creeping into his voice. Jamal felt eyes on him, and fear settled over him like a shadow. He knew he was trapped, and every attempt to prove his case only made it worse. Davis shoved Jamal hard toward the patrol car, and Jamal, feeling his throat tighten with anger and hurt, staggered but did not fall. Not only are you black, you're sloppy, and in the eyes of the law, you're just another criminal, he screamed, his words like knives stabbing into Jamal's chest. Jamal gritted his teeth and felt the entire system against him. He stood surrounded by officers, each of whom didn't understand what was happening, but he could feel the tension in the air. He looked at the faces of people, distorted by prejudice and hatred, and he knew that his fight wasn't just against one person, but against an entire system that had already condemned him before he could speak. You can't humiliate me even if you try, he said, but his voice was weak. He felt the darkness gathering over him, and he knew that every word he spoke could be his last in this fight. Davis, sensing victory, turned to Jamal and said mockingly, Well, let's see how you look in court when I tell everyone what you did. You knew you didn't stand a chance, didn't you? Jamal, knowing that every step he took could be his last, tried to remain confident, but a sense of hopelessness was growing inside him. He knew that if he couldn't stand up for his rights now, he would be forever imprinted in the derogatory light he so feared. The sirens were still sounding in the distance, and he knew that a real fight lay ahead of him, not only for his freedom, but for the right to be a man in the eyes of this system. But at that moment, he also felt that his will was not broken, and no matter how hard it was, he had to keep fighting, despite all the fear and hatred that surrounded him. Jamal stood in front of the patrol car, his mind racing with thoughts of how quickly life could change. Davis, feeling victorious, was turning up the heat. "You know what they say about people like you? That you don't belong in this world," he said with disdain. His words resonated in the air like a bell, causing fear and anger. "I am a human being and I have rights," Jamal said, but his voice was no longer as confident. He felt fear creeping into his heart, and it only made him feel more desperate. "You have no right to detain me," he tried again, trying to pull himself together. "Do you really believe that? What law are you going to use to stop me? Your skin color just makes you a target," Davis barked, looking at Jamal with disdain. He knew he was at the height of his power and he wasn't going to let this opportunity go. Soon the other officers who had come closer began exchanging glances, and Jamal noticed that some of them were already against him. He felt hatred boiling inside him for this system that had been against him from the very beginning. "I am not a criminal. I am a successful businessman, and you cannot just ignore me," he shouted, aware that his words might sound desperate. But Davis just smirked at the other officers. "Look at him trying to play the victim. That's typical of his kind," he said with disdain. Every word he said was aimed not just at Jamal, but at the other officers as well, to convince them that he was right. "You, the black millionaire, have lost touch with reality. You think you can act like you're immune from justice, but I'm here to remind you that it's not about how much money you have. It's about who you are," Davis continued, his voice a wistful, clenched horn. Jamal felt the rage simmer inside him. He knew he couldn't let Davis win. His life and his reputation were on the line. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through," he said, trying to sound strong. Davis, feeling threatened, just chuckled. "What do you mean? You thought that if you made money, everything would be different? You're still black in this white world." His words were like bullets piercing Jamal's heart, and he knew that this confrontation was not just a conflict between two men, but a clash of two worlds. The situation was getting worse. Like clouds covering the sun, the shadows were gathering above them. "How can you expect justice when the entire system is against you?" Jamal said, his voice shaking with emotion. He felt the fear filling him, but he couldn't let it take over. "You're wrong if you think I'm going to give up," he said, trying to maintain his confidence, but his words sounded like a cry for help. At that moment, one of the new officers, young and inexperienced, stepped forward. "Hey, wait, maybe we should figure this out," he said, and there was a note of doubt in his voice. "What the hell are you doing?" Davis barked, his face contorted with rage. "We're arresting a criminal. Are you really going to stand up for him? This is no time for doubt." Jamal felt his hopes begin to fade, but he was not about to give up. "Justice must prevail. I am not a criminal, and no one has the right to humiliate me just because of the color of my skin," he said, raising his head. His words were filled with power, but even he knew that his confidence was drowning in Davis's shadow. "So what are you going to do when this law makes you a victim?" Davis commented with a wry smile as his cohorts grew increasingly aggressive. "You think you can get out of this by simply claiming you're better? All you're going to do is make things worse for yourself." Jamal's blood was boiling. He knew that it wasn't just his freedom that was at stake, but his dignity as a human being. "I am a human being, and I have rights," he screamed, and in that moment his voice resonated like a challenge to everything that was wrong. "Right? You're just an insignificant cog in this system, and I'm here to remind you of it," Davis said, his voice full of hatred. He pushed Jamal toward the car, pressing him against the cold metal. "You don't know who you're messing with. I could easily make your life hell." Jamal felt his life slipping out of his hands. In that moment, he realized that this fight was not just for him, but for everyone who faced the same prejudice. His heart was pounding, and he knew he had to act. "I will not remain silent," he screamed, gathering his last strength. And then, as if in answer to his words, there was a loud noise. Across the street, a group of people who had seen what was happening began to gather. They began shouting words of support, and Jamal felt a powerful wave of solidarity building. "Look what's happening. This is wrong," one of the men shouted, and it was the signal for everyone to unite against the system. Davis, seeing the growing number of people, felt his confidence begin to waver. "You have no right to interfere," he shouted, but Jamal already knew that his voice was not alone now. He looked at the people who had begun to support him and knew that this fight was not over. Every word, every cry became another step towards justice, and Jamal felt that his story was just beginning. Jamal stood there, gritting his teeth, feeling all eyes in the crowd on him. Davis, aware that his power was at stake, stepped closer, his face twisted in hatred. "Look at him, that smug millionaire. How many people do you have around you? How many of them can actually do the work?" he said with disdain, looking at Jamal with disdain. "You are nothing more than a fraud who only got to where he is because of his money. I see who you really are. You are just another black man playing in the big leagues and not realizing that his skin color will always define his place in this world." Davis spoke with fury, and his words sounded like a weapon aimed at Jamal's dignity. Each word struck Jamal like lightning, and he felt his inner world crumbling under the weight of humiliation. "You have no right to insult me," he tried to cry out, but his voice was weak, like the cry of a drowning man. His words had no power, and Jamal knew that Davis was not going to stop. "Oh, sure, you have rights, but in this world, that's nothing more than a joke," Davis said with disdain. "Your money can't protect you from reality. You have no idea how quickly people like you can be broken." Jamal felt his face heat up with anger and humiliation. He knew Davis was using every moment to overwhelm him, to make him feel even more helpless. "You are not a man. You are just a pale servant given power over others," Davis continued, his voice like the hiss of poison. The crowd behind Jamal began to shout in his defense, but their words merged into background noise. "You're black, and you can't change that. No matter how hard you try, you'll always look like a criminal in the eyes of the law," Davis said, his voice filled with confidence, underscored by hatred. Jamal, feeling his strength draining from him, looked at Davis, and a spark lit in his eyes. "I will not tolerate your insults. I am a man, and I deserve respect," he said, trying to put all his strength into his words. But Davis just chuckled. "You really think that means anything to me? You're just another black man trying to take a place that doesn't belong to him. I could break you in a heartbeat if I wanted to," he said, his voice thick with menace. Like a predator, Davis stepped closer, pinning Jamal against the car. "You don't know how I can make your life hell. You think your career and your money will protect you from what I can do to you? I know how the system works, and you're just a victim I can easily pacify." His words were like sharp blades piercing Jamal. At that moment, Jamal felt his inner anger overflowing. He knew that if he didn't fight back, he would be trampled by this system of hatred. "You can't break me even if you try," he said, but his words sounded weaker than he had hoped. Bold words for a man who's already lost. "Look at him," Davis shouted to the other officers who were just watching the situation as if it were a spectacle. "This is what a black millionaire does when he's in trouble. He's just trying to elude justice with his money and status." Jamal felt his inner peace crumble. He knew this moment should not be the end of his fight. "I will not let this happen," he said, but even he knew that fear and humiliation were piercing him like sharp needles. Davis, feeling powerful, smirked. "I love seeing you suffer. You'll never be able to change the way people perceive you. You're just confirming every stereotype that exists. You're just a pawn in a game you can never win." These words, like a bolt from the blue, threw Jamal into confusion. He knew that not only his freedom was at stake, but also his dignity as a human being. He stood there, overcome with fear, but deep down he knew that he had to continue to fight, despite the pressure coming from Davis. "I am a human being and I have the right to defend myself," he shouted, and the cry, filled with emotion, filled the air, causing some spectators to freeze. Davis just smirked, looking at him with disdain. "You think your words mean anything? I'm here to remind you that you're nothing. You don't deserve respect, and I'm going to prove it," he said, looking around at the crowd, who were increasingly becoming witnesses to this humiliating spectacle. Jamal knew he couldn't let fear get the better of him. He felt the anger building inside him, like a wave about to burst forth. But to do that, he had to find the strength to resist the humiliation Davis was trying to inflict on him. "I won't let this go on," he said, raising his head and looking Davis straight in the eye. A determination was blazing inside him, and he knew that this wasn't just a fight for his freedom, but a fight for all those who faced similar hatred. The crowd watching this scene grew animated. People began to whisper among themselves, exchanging glances of confusion and anger. Some of them looked alarmed, their faces reflecting shock at the way Davis was humiliating Jamal. Others seemed ready to speak in his defense. "This is insane. He shouldn't be doing this to him," one of the men said, taking a step closer to Davis. His voice was firm and determined, and he looked to the others for support. Some nodded in agreement, while others clenched their fists as they watched the humiliation. "Do you all see this?" he continued, raising his voice to get attention. "This is simply unacceptable. A man in handcuffs is not a criminal. He is a victim of racism." His words drew a wave of approval from several people in the crowd, who began chanting, "Justice, justice." Davis, seeing the growing number of people, became furious. He shouted at them, "You have no right to interfere with my work. It is the law." But his words only increased the discontent of the crowd. They were not going to just stand by and watch an innocent man being humiliated in front of everyone. "You can't just treat him like that because he's black," the woman in front shouted. Her voice was like a thundercloud gathering power. She took a step forward, her eyes blazing with anger. "How dare you? You have no right to judge him by the color of his skin." Davis, out of control, looked at Jamal with hatred, as if he were the source of all his problems. He clearly felt the power that had been on his side slipping away. "You don't understand that he's a criminal," he shouted, but there was no longer any confidence in his voice. Jamal felt the support of the people in the crowd giving him strength. He turned to them, seeing that they were ready to speak up for him. "This is not just my fight," he said, his voice strong and confident. "This is a fight for everyone who has ever been prejudiced and humiliated." The phrase exploded in the crowd like a spark that ignited a fire. People began shouting words of encouragement, holding signs that read "No to racism," and "Everyone is equal." The atmosphere grew tense, and Jamal felt himself finding the strength to fight. Yes, that's his job, but that doesn't mean he has the right to humiliate a person, another man shouted, and the crowd responded with cheers. The excitement grew, and cries of "Justice," and "We are with you," filled the air. Davis, realizing the situation was getting out of hand, tried to save face. He glanced at his colleagues, and several of them began to slowly back away, embarrassed by what was happening. "This is just not right, and I can't just deal with it," said one officer, looking confused. Jamal felt hope rise in his heart. He looked out at the crowd, seeing their support strengthen his resolve. "We must stand together," he shouted, his voice ringing out across the crowd like a cry for unity. Davis, feeling his authority being undermined, looked at Jamal again. "You haven't won yet. I'm still going to arrest you," he said with hatred, but his voice was no longer as confident. The people around him were starting to surround him, and it seemed like the situation was about to explode. "You can't just humiliate him," one of the men said, breaking the silence. "We're here to defend truth and justice." The crowd roared in response, supporting his words. With each passing moment, Jamal felt this situation taking on new meaning. This wasn't just a detention, it was a fight for rights, for dignity, for everyone who had ever felt oppressed. He realized he was not alone, and that support gave him strength that could not be suppressed. "This is not the end," he said, looking at Davis with a steely determination. At that moment, he knew that despite the pressure, he would fight to the end. The crowd of black people watching the scene was a mixture of anger, fear, and determination. Every one of them, regardless of age or life experience, felt the weight of what was happening. Many of them recalled their own stories of prejudice and discrimination, and their hearts filled with anger. Maya, a young woman standing in the front row, felt anger boiling inside her. "This is happening over and over again," she thought, her hands clenching into fists. "How can you humiliate someone just because of the color of their skin? I can't just stand by and watch them get humiliated." She thought of her brother, who had once been stopped and searched for no reason, simply because he looked suspicious. Her eyes lit up with determination. She knew she had to speak out. Next to her stood Jeremy, a middle-aged man who had once worked in law enforcement but left because of the systemic problems he saw from the inside. "This is what I deal with every day," he thought as he watched Jamal's humiliation. "I can't believe this is still happening. We have to come together and stand up to this." He knew this was no time for silence. Each of them was part of something bigger than their individual suffering. Realizing they couldn't just stand by, a group of black people began to boldly step forward. "This is wrong," Maya screamed, feeling her voice penetrate the hearts of others. We will not tolerate humiliation. We are human beings, and our lives matter." The crowd around her responded, and the many voices merged into a single chorus. "We stand with you, brother," one of the men shouted, raising his fist in support. Rage raged inside him, but he felt that together with the others they could do something important. Each of them was ready to stand up against oppression. In the crowd, another man, Ricardo, watched with deep sorrow. "I once thought that things were changing, that we were moving forward, but this is proof that we still live in a society that does not want to see us as equals," he mused, feeling his heart fill with bitterness. He knew that silence was not the answer, and so, taking a deep breath, he moved closer to the crowd. "This injustice must stop," he said, trying to inspire the others. The crowd was beginning to coalesce as one. They looked at Jamal, hope in their eyes. Every word they spoke was a challenge to a system that had allowed prejudice and hatred to fester for too long. "We will not be silent anymore," one woman shouted, raising her hand and pointing at Davis. "We are here to support our brother." For a moment, it felt like the world stopped. All eyes were on Jamal, and everyone felt his struggle, his pain, and his determination. They understood that in that moment, they were all part of something bigger than just individual stories. This was a collective resistance, a symbol of unity against oppression. No one should have to experience this, Jeremy thought, feeling the wave of support growing. He knew they could create change if they worked together. In that moment, he felt the entire crowd coming together as one, each of them a part of the resistance. "Let's show them that we are not afraid," Maya shouted, and her words spread through the crowd like fire, setting hearts ablaze. People began chanting, "Justice, justice," and each cry grew louder, filling the air with determination. Every black person in the crowd knew that this was their opportunity to make a difference, to show that they were not just victims of the system, but people willing to fight for their rights. They understood that unity is strength, and now was the time to act to help Jamal and each other. Jamal felt this flow of energy and support, and he was ready to fight. This was not just his fight, this was a fight for the future, for equality and dignity that should be available to everyone. Jamal stood under the weight of Davis's gaze, feeling the fear and humiliation wash over him, but at the same time, a spark ignited in his chest. With every shout from the crowd, with every word of encouragement, he realized more and more that he could not let Davis win. "This is not just my fight," he thought, his resolve growing. Through all the rage and contempt pouring out of Davis, Jamal felt his own voice grow louder. "I'm not a criminal, and I'm not going to let this cop humiliate me," he whispered to himself, trying to push away the feeling of helplessness, his mind filled with memories of how hard it had been to get everything he had, and how his struggle should never have been in vain. At that moment he stepped forward, coming very close to Davis, and even though he had handcuffs on his hands, he looked up and met the officer's gaze. "I'm not going to stay silent and let you continue to humiliate me or anyone else," he said with a firmness he didn't expect from himself. His voice, filled with determination, pierced the air, and the crowd froze, waiting to see what would happen next. Davis, seeing this confidence, was momentarily confused, but then his face contorted with rage. "You think you can threaten me? You're just a black millionaire trying to hide behind your wealth," he growled, trying to regain control of the situation, but his words no longer had the same force as before. More and more people in the crowd began to speak up for Jamal, their voices merging into one. Jamal felt a determination building inside him. He felt the flames of anger filling him. He thought of all those who had been discriminated against, of his friends and family who had suffered the same humiliation, and he knew that now was his chance to be their voice. "I'm not afraid of you, Davis. I'm not a criminal, and I won't let you insult me or anyone else," he said, his words full of strength and determination. The crowd responded with a collective cheer, and Jamal noticed them starting to move closer to lend their shoulders to his struggle. "You're not alone, brother," one of the men shouted, standing next to Jamal. "We're with you." With each passing moment, Jamal felt his inner shackles begin to loosen. He was fighting not only for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt oppressed and humiliated. "How many more innocent people must suffer because of people like you?" he asked, looking at Davis with the hatred that once filled him with fear. "Every time you look at someone just because they're black, you're bringing up this evil legacy of hate." A shadow of doubt crossed Davis's face. He had not expected such resistance. Jamal's steadfastness, his confidence, was a challenge not only to him but to his entire authority. He took a step back, embarrassed and angry. "Your words mean nothing," Davis shouted, but his voice was no longer as menacing as before. The crowd was beginning to heat up, and every shout from Jamal was matched by a new stream of energy from those around him. "We're here to protect each other." Feeling supported, Jamal took a deep breath and continued, "We demand justice. Each of us has the right to be treated with dignity, and today we are not just standing here, we are standing up for our rights." His words resonated with the crowd, and they began chanting, "Justice, justice." Davis, realizing his time was running out, stepped forward again, trying to regain control of the situation. "I'm still going to arrest you. This is illegal, and you can't stop me," he growled, but his voice was no longer as confident. The crowd, instead of backing down, became even more vocal. Jamal, emboldened by the support, could not contain his emotions. He knew that this was his moment. "You can't arrest me without cause. I did not break the law," he said, and the crowd again responded with loud cheers. Each cry reminded him that he was not alone. Davis, feeling himself losing control, paused for a moment, a shadow of doubt in his eyes. He couldn't understand how one man, surrounded by a crowd, could cause such a strong reaction. Jamal, sensing this vulnerability, took another step forward, even more confidently. "We are here to show that this system cannot suppress us. We demand respect and equality," he shouted, and his words exploded in the air, raising the spirit of the crowd even higher. They stood as one, ready to fight for their rights. In that moment, Jamal knew he wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting for the future. For those who hadn't yet found the strength to raise their voices, he felt the fear fading, replaced by courage and determination. Jamal turned to the crowd, his eyes shining with hope. "We are together now. Let's show that we will not tolerate racism and oppression." Jamal stood there, surrounded by supporters, feeling his inner tension slowly fade away, replaced by determination and hope. The crowd was like a powerful wave, rolling over Davis, and every shout was a boost to him. Every breath became a source of strength. "You can't just get rid of me," Jamal said, looking into the eyes of the policeman, who was clearly losing confidence. He knew that this was his moment. The crowd reminded him that they were together, and he was not alone in this fight. Davis, feeling himself losing control, tried to maintain authority. "You all don't understand. This is my job. I follow protocol," he shouted, but his words were unconvincing. He was beginning to realize that under the pressure of Jamal and the crowd, his excuses were falling on deaf ears. "Protocol has no right to humiliate people," one woman in the crowd shouted, and her words were met with loud cheers. "We are not going to let you use your power to suppress us." The crowd erupted in shouts that echoed around the area. "Justice! Justice!" Jamal stepped closer to Davis, leaving no room for doubt. "You think you have power over me just because of the color of my skin? You have no right to judge me, and I will not stand by while you humiliate me and my brothers and sisters," he said, his voice loud and clear, reminding everyone that there was no room for fear in this fight. He felt a burning desire to change the situation, and he felt the crowd's support grow with every word he spoke. His words became a mantra for everyone who had witnessed this humiliation. Jamal realized that in this moment, they had all become one, a united front against oppression. Davis, trying to regain control, began rubbing his hands and clenching his fists nervously. "I'm not going to let this happen," he shouted, but his words were becoming less convincing. His room was filled with fear and uncertainty. He was no longer the cop who humiliated others with impunity. He was an object of contempt. The crowd once again shouted in support of Jamal, and in that moment his heart was filled with strength. He knew that this was more than just an arrest. This was a moment that could change everything. "We are not here to remain silent. We are here to fight for truth and justice," he said, and his voice echoed in the hearts of the people who were ready to support him. "I won't leave you alone," Davis shouted, but even he felt that his words were useless. "You'll get everything you deserve, and it won't be fun," but the threats no longer had any power. Jamal stood there with a defiant look, full of determination. Realizing that the situation was getting out of control, Davis began to notice the many phones pointed at him. People were filming everything that was happening. The moment was captured on camera. It was public. This added even more tension to his actions. He was under surveillance, and every move he made could be seen as an abuse of power. "You cannot silence me," and I will not let you ruin the lives of those who stand next to me," Jamal shouted, and the crowd responded with a loud cry of yes, yes. With each passing moment, more and more people joined them and the atmosphere became more and more tense. Jamal knew that this was an opportunity not only for him, but for everyone who had ever felt oppressed. "We know our rights, and we will fight for them," he said, and his words brought a wave of inspiration to the crowd. They were no longer just spectators, they were participants in this event, and each of them was ready to act. "Step back, Davis. We will not have you humiliating our brother," someone in the crowd shouted, and that was the signal. People began to move forward, wanting to support Jamal. Davis, losing control, raised his clenched fists in a threat. "I'll call for backup," he shouted, but he knew that it would not stop them. Jamal looked at him with hatred, but also determination. He felt his own power grow as he faced this system of hatred. "You cannot use your form of power to suppress us," he said, knowing that this was the moment when he could change everything. The crowd, encouraged by his courage, chanted, "We stand with you, we stand with you." Their voices grew louder, like a powerful anthem inspiring each of them to fight. Jamal knew this was just the beginning, and he was not going to back down. The fire of struggle burned in his soul, and he knew that he was now representing everyone who had ever suffered from racism and prejudice. "Together we are stronger, and together we can change the world," he said, and the words rolled through the crowd, evoking a new wave of support and determination. Jamal, feeling himself becoming the center of attention, knew that this was his chance, a chance to fight, a chance to make a difference, and a chance to achieve justice for himself and for everyone. Jamal felt the energy of the crowd seeping into him, filling him with determination. He glanced at Davis and saw that he was beginning to lose confidence. The cop no longer looked threatening, and despite the handcuffs on his hands, Jamal could feel the fear slowly fading. "You cannot arrest me without cause," he shouted, feeling his words begin to resonate with everyone in the crowd. "I am not a criminal, and I will not allow you to humiliate me or my people." His voice became more confident, and every syllable he spoke broke the silence, filling the air with determination. The crowd responded with support. "Justice, justice," they chanted, and the chorus became a powerful weapon against prejudice and oppression. Jamal noticed how the people standing nearby began to unite, and he knew that they were becoming one, ready to act. Davis, losing control of the situation, began to panic. He knew the crowd was growing more and his own power was waning. "Everyone back up," he growled, but his words no longer carried the same force. Instead, the crowd continued to close in on him, ready to support Jamal. "We stand for the truth, and we will not remain silent," one of the women shouted, and her voice once again fueled the others' determination. Jamal, raising his head and shoulders, stepped forward. His face was radiant with courage, and he felt confidence rising within him. He knew that now was his time. Suddenly he leaned over and reached for his t-shirt, where his identification was. "If you're going to arrest me, you're going to have to show me proof," he said, holding the ID up in front of Davis. His voice grew louder, and he felt his words giving power to the whole situation. "You can't just treat people like trash," Jeremy shouted from the crowd, and his words resonated with everyone present. It wasn't just Jamal versus Davis anymore. It was the fight of everyone who had ever faced oppression and prejudice. They were rallying around him, and every cry became a manifesto of resistance. Davis, noticing Jamal's growing support, began to realize that his powers were limited. He felt his confidence begin to fade, and panic flashed in his eyes. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he shouted, but his words no longer sounded threatening. The crowd, looking at him, began to laugh. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Jamal shot back, and the laughter from the crowd only strengthened his resolve. He took a step closer, feeling every move give him strength. "I'm a self-made black millionaire. I'm not going to let anyone, under any circumstances, put me down." At that moment, Jamal remembered his parents, how they taught him that he should fight for his rights, and this thought gave him even more confidence. He felt a fire burning in his soul. "I will fight for my honor and for the honor of all who suffer from bias," he said, and his words pierced the air, causing a new outpouring of support from the crowd. People began to rise and come closer, ready to stand behind Jamal, inspired by his courage. Each of them felt that this was their moment to do something important to stop this unfair treatment. Davis finally realized that his position was becoming increasingly vulnerable. "I'm not going to back down," he shouted, but his voice was no longer so confident. The crowd began to shout for truth and justice, and each one was filled with determination. "We won't back down until you admit this is wrong," Maya shouted, and the crowd cheered again. They felt their power growing, and Jamal, standing in the center, knew they were creating a wave of change. "Justice for all," he shouted, and his voice filled the space, bringing people to their feet. They began to unite, and the crowd became a powerful movement. At that moment, Jamal finally felt that he was not just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone. With every word spoken and every shout from the crowd, Jamal felt the fear drain away and courage and determination fill his heart. He stepped forward, looking at Davis, who was now one step away from confusion. "You need to know that racism and prejudice will not be tolerated. I am here to fight," the crowd shouted back. "We stand with you. We stand with you." They knew this was the beginning of change. Jamal, empowered and supported, knew this fight would continue, and he was ready to be part of it. His eyes were shining with determination, and he knew their voices were uniting into a powerful chorus, ready to stand against oppression. Davis felt the ground shift from under him, and despite his strength, he knew this situation was no longer under his control. Every step back was a step closer to realizing that he was not only a cop, but part of a system that had allowed situations like this to happen with impunity for too long. "I'm not leaving until I get justice," Jamal shouted, and his words became a symbol of the fight. He knew there would be many difficulties ahead, but with this crowd at his back, he knew that together they could change everything. With each new cry and each new step, they were getting closer to justice, and Jamal, realizing this, was ready to move forward, preparing for a new fight for his rights and the rights of everyone who had ever suffered from racism. From the moment Jamal stepped forward and confronted Officer Davis, his life changed dramatically. The crowd continued to support him, and this moment was not only a show of strength, but also the beginning of his fight for the truth. Despite the tension of the situation, Jamal felt his confidence grow, and he realized that this was not just an incident. This was the beginning of a fight that could change his life and the lives of many others. After the incident on the street, Jamal spent weeks collecting evidence. He knew that police officers often hide behind their status and do everything possible to avoid responsibility, but his support from the community grew, and people began to take to the streets to express their dissatisfaction with the police. He decided to take the case to court. "If I don't fight for my rights, who will?" he told his friends when they gathered to discuss the situation. His lawyer, an experienced human rights defender, was determined to support Jamal in this fight. They began collecting all the evidence they could: video footage, eyewitness accounts, and legal documents. Jamal knew it wouldn't be easy. Black citizens had faced bias in the justice system for years, and he knew he might face more difficulties, but his will to win was stronger. He became a symbol of the fight for black rights in his area, and his story attracted the attention of the media and activists. At his first court appearance, Jamal walked into the courtroom with his head held high. He knew that his life and the lives of many others depended on this trial. In the courtroom, he met Davis, who seemed completely confident of his acquittal. The police officer looked as if he did not realize that his actions had serious consequences. This only strengthened Jamal's resolve. During the hearing, Jamal's attorney presented video footage of the incident, showing Davis humiliating and intimidating Jamal, as well as eyewitness accounts that corroborated his account. Each new witness who took the stand emphasized that Davis had acted outside protocol and had no grounds to arrest Jamal. "He was just walking down the street. That's no reason to arrest him," one witness said, and her words caused a wave of support in the courtroom. Each testimony only strengthened Jamal's case and undermined Davis's confidence. Davis, sensing the situation was changing, began to get nervous. His defense attorney was trying to paint Jamal as someone who could cause trouble, but each time, those attempts backfired. "You can't just make assumptions based on skin color," Jamal's attorney exclaimed, drawing cheers from the audience. Jamal sat in the courtroom and felt his heart fill with hope. He knew this wasn't just his fight, but a fight for everyone who had ever faced bias and racism. He knew that if they won, it would be a significant step toward change. When it came time for Jamal to take the stand, he approached the stand with determination. "I'm here because I was humiliated just because of the color of my skin. I'm here because I want my voice to be heard. I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through." he said, his words echoing through the courtroom, causing a wave of emotion. Jamal continued to talk about his life, his dreams, and the importance of being heard. "I worked hard to get where I am, and I'm not going to let anyone take that away from me. We, as Black people, have the right to our voices, our dreams, and our lives without fear," he said, and the crowd in the room roared in approval. After a lengthy hearing, the court ruled in Jamal's favor. The moment was a triumph not only for him, but for everyone who supported him. The judge declared, Officer Davis's actions were wrongful and contrary to the most basic principles of justice. Every citizen has the right to have his rights respected and protected. Jamal felt his heart fill with joy and relief. He knew that this was not just a victory for him, but a victory for everyone who had ever felt oppressed. The crowd outside the courthouse erupted in cheers and support. They knew that this fight was just the beginning. This court victory marked the beginning of a new era for Jamal and his community. He became a symbol of resistance to racism and bias, and his story inspired many to fight for their rights. Jamal knew there was still work to do, but he was now ready to continue his fight and inspire others to make a difference. This victory was not just an individual one. It opened the eyes of many to the systemic problems that Black citizens face. Jamal, having gained confidence and support, was determined to continue this fight for justice, making the world a better place for himself and for future generations. After the trial, Officer Davis's life changed dramatically. Although he continued to work for the police, his reputation was irreparably damaged. At first, he ignored the gossip and talk around him, hoping that it would soon die down. However, every morning when he arrived for work, his colleagues looked at him with displeasure and judgment. His actions became a topic of discussion within the police department, and many of his colleagues began to question his professionalism and moral character. Every time he went out on patrol, Davis felt the tension in the air. The citizens he encountered sometimes expressed displeasure. Noting his name and history, his confidence, once impenetrable, was now eroded. He began to notice how people in his neighborhood began to avoid him, and sometimes even openly protested against him. Fear and hatred filled his workdays, and he no longer felt safe. Despite being a police officer, unable to cope with the pressure, Davis turned to alcohol for solace. Night shifts became regular drinking sessions, and he began missing work due to intoxication. His addiction grew, and soon he was on the verge of being fired. There was no longer any confidence or pride in his life, only a darkness that enveloped him as he tried to cope with the consequences of his irrational behavior. Friends and colleagues began to distance themselves from him. He was losing the support he once had, and as a result, his personal life also fell apart. Divorce from his wife was inevitable. She could no longer tolerate his changed character and constant problems with his work. He found himself alone, lost and isolated from the world. Rumors of his bias and racism spread beyond the department. His participation in protests against racism and bias in society only made things worse. He became the target of hatred and scorn on social media, where his name was associated with violent actions and unjust arrests. At one of the local council meetings, residents, including Black activists, raised the issue of the need to investigate Davis's actions. They demanded that he be suspended from service and that his actions be subjected to a thorough investigation. Davis had no chance of acquittal. He knew that he would have to pay for his actions. When he received his notice to leave the police force, it was the final blow. He felt like his world was crumbling around him. It wasn't just the loss of his job. It meant the loss of his identity. He was no longer a police officer, and his past achievements seemed insignificant compared to the shame he had brought upon himself. Davis sank into a deep depression. He began to avoid social interactions, remaining isolated, hiding within his four walls, surrounded by emptiness. There was no longer any room for hope in his life, only regret for what he had lost. He often thought about how wrong he had been and what he could have done differently, but his sincere regrets did not change what had happened, and he knew he could not turn back time. Meanwhile, Jamal and his community continued to fight for equality and justice. Each step forward became a symbol of the change that was needed for their community. Jamal used his platform to inspire others and create space for dialogue about racism and bias. While Jamal raised his voice to fight for rights, Davis remained in the shadow of his own actions. He witnessed changes he had never thought possible. The lesson he learned was brutal, and his life was forever affected by this tragedy. Gradually, local authorities began to take steps to raise awareness of racism in the police force. Training programs and seminars were held for officers so that they could understand the importance of respecting every person, regardless of race. These changes were an important step forward. But for Davis, it no longer mattered. He remained abandoned and lost, dreaming only of a chance to change his fate. Ultimately, his story became a warning about how prejudice and hatred can ruin the lives of not only those who suffer from it, but also those who make the wrong decisions. After the successful trial, Jamal felt his life began to change for the better. The victory in court not only restored his honor, but also opened up new opportunities. He became a symbol of resistance to racism and bias, and his story inspired many others. The trial became a catalyst for Jamal's activism in his community. He became a leading activist working on issues of racial equality and human rights. By organizing local initiatives and meetings, he helped create a platform for discussing the issues that Black people in his area faced. His personal experiences became important lessons for others, and Jamal became an inspiration to many who also experienced discrimination. The trial also had a positive impact on Jamal's business. As a successful entrepreneur, he gained the support of the local community and his company began to flourish. People began to trust him more and his clients felt that they were supporting a man who stood for justice. This not only strengthened his financial position, but also gave him the opportunity to continue his work in the social sphere. Inspired by his experiences, Jamal began conducting educational workshops and trainings on racism, bias, and human rights. He shared his story, talking about the importance of standing up to oppression, and how everyone can make a difference. His workshops attracted a large number of participants, and he became a vocal advocate for education as a way to combat bias. On the personal front, Jamal was also able to reconnect with his family and friends. He began to participate in local events and became more open and approachable. His relationships with his parents and friends grew stronger, and they began to support him in his new endeavors. Jamal also found a new love, a woman who shared his passion for activism and the fight for equality. Jamal joined forces with local organizations and activists, which allowed him to expand his influence and increase the number of people who supported his cause. Together, they launched campaigns aimed at improving the lives of Black people in their community, including programs to improve education, improve access to health care, and combat unemployment. As a result of Jamal and his community's struggle, the police began to rethink their practices. The new approach to police training focused on respect for human rights and cultural differences. Jamal became part of this change, participating in workshops and conversations with police officers, giving him the opportunity to share his experiences and teach them respect for everyone. Ultimately, Jamal's life changed dramatically. Not only was he able to restore his reputation, but he also became an active participant in the Black rights movement. His story became a symbol of hope and strength, inspiring many others to fight for justice. Through his efforts, he helped create a more just and equal society where everyone can feel heard and respected. Jamal continued his activism in the community, gradually seeing the fruits of his efforts. He became a well-known figure, speaking at rallies, organizing educational programs, and establishing cooperation between various organizations. His passion for fighting for justice inspired many, and he began to gather around him a group of like-minded people ready to make a change. As more and more people began to pay attention to the issues of racism and bias, real change began to happen in their community. Local authorities began to implement programs aimed at improving relations between the police and citizens, introducing new approaches and methods of work. Jamal was actively involved in these processes. His voice became an important factor in developing strategies to ensure safety and respect for the rights of all citizens. One day, on the anniversary of his court victory, Jamal organized a rally that attracted thousands of people. The event was the culmination of his efforts, the day he felt his dreams of a just society were beginning to come true. People of different races and backgrounds stood together, supporting each other, and it was a testament to the change that had come from working together. As he stood on stage delivering his speech, Jamal spoke not only of what had been accomplished, but also of what still needed to be done. He encouraged everyone to continue to fight for equality and justice, reminding everyone that change takes time, patience, and unity. His words inspired many, and the crowd responded with enthusiastic applause and cries of encouragement. Jamal knew there was still work to do, but he no longer felt alone. His community's support and solidarity gave him strength. He knew this fight wasn't just about him, it was about the future for everyone who had experienced bias. At the end of the rally, when people had left, Jamal looked at his friends and supporters and felt that this was only the beginning. He knew that his life and the lives of many others would never be the same again. The road to change was long, but he was full of hope and determination to continue the fight for a better future. And so, Jamal became a symbol of change, inspiring people to take action and showing that even in the most difficult circumstances, it is possible to find the strength to fight for your rights. His story is not only a tale of overcoming racism, but also a story of how unity and determination can change the world. We hope you enjoyed Jamal's story and his fight for justice. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you experienced racism in your life? Your stories matter, and we want to hear every single one of them. You're more than just an audience member, you're part of our community, and your opinions matter to us. Every comment you make, every word you write makes our channel stronger and helps us create content that really matters. We truly appreciate each of you, and your support inspires us to new ideas and projects. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and give it a like. It really helps us grow and reach new heights. We want you to always feel like you are part of our journey. Have a wonderful day and remember that together we can change the world.